This is the Baltic Sea looking north from a headland close to the northernmost point in modern-day Poland. Not far from where I am standing occurred the largest and second largest maritime disasters of all time, with losses several times that of the more famous Titanic. This is the story of the sinking of the ship that caused more deaths than any other in history. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, the war was decidedly lost for Nazi Germany. This was obvious to everyone, but not everyone reacted until it was far too late. At the end of January 1945, as the Red Army raced unstoppably west through Poland and East Prussia towards Königsberg and Gdańsk, mass panic set in amongst the German civilian population. Terrified by Goebbels' propaganda and possibly also from eyewitness accounts from soldiers on leave about the ferocity of the Soviet troops, the largest exodus in human history took place on foot or with horse-drawn carriages in temperatures which reached -20 at night. Most of these refugees were women, very old men, and children, as men and boys between 14 and 60 had been conscripted to fight in the Volksturm, the Nazi version of the Home Guard. As the Soviet forces cut off East Prussia by reaching the Vistula Lagoon to the north of Elbląg, the only way across this body of water was by crossing the ice. The terrified refugees were harried by Soviet aircraft, just as the Luftwaffe had done to refugees in Belgium, France and the Soviet Union. What these people wanted was to find refuge further west, either by reaching Gdansk and a train that would take them out of their misery, or if that were not possible, then a ship from Gdynia. The National Socialist Community, Kraft der Freude, KDF, was founded on the 27th of November 1933 as an organisation of the German Labour Front, DAF. Its aim was to fulfill the Nazi regime's aim of establishing an ethnic people's community of all Germans through providing leisure activities. With the Amt für Reisen, Wandern und Urlaub, that is the Office for Travel, Hiking and Holidays, the KDF was the largest tour operator during the National Socialist era. Part of what the KDF provided was, amongst other things, which included the largest holiday camp ever built, and, up until that time, the largest cruise liner. The cruise liner was the Wilhelm Gustloff. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built by Blum and Voss in Hamburg for the German Labour Front in happier times for Nazi Germany. The ship owner was thus the DAF. However, the Wilhelm Gustloff was managed, crewed and maintained by the Hamburg South American Steamship Company, HSDG. It was launched on the 5th of May 1937 when Hedwig Gustloff, the widow of Wilhelm Gustloff, gave it its name. Wilhelm Gustloff was stylized as a martyr to the National Socialist cause. The launch was done in the presence of Adolf Hitler. On the 15th of March 1938, the ship was completed. Its maiden voyage commenced on the 23rd of March of the same year. The architect Waldemar Brinkmann had been commissioned with the interior design. It was to be a ship without classes. The interior of the cabins for passenger and crew members was essentially the same. For the passengers, there were 224 2 and 233 4-bed cabins with 1 and 2 bunk beds respectively. In addition, 3 cabins furnished with 3 bunk beds were reserved for larger families. Each cabin had a wardrobe for each occupant, 1 or 2 sinks with running cold and warm water, and a seating area consisting of a table, chairs, and a sofa. As was still common practice on passenger ships at the time, the toilets, showers, and bathtubs as communal facilities were outside the cabins, but were separate for passengers and crew. There was a large lounge with 60 seats in front of a swimming pool. It was not entirely a ship without class, as the Hitler Youth and the Bund Deutscher Mädel BDM had a floating youth hostel with accommodation which was not quite as good and private as the accommodation was for the other guests. 40 individual cabins were available for members of the ship's command, engineers, mechanics, radio operators, doctors, and tour guides. The remaining crew lived in 39 2-bed and 77 4-bed cabins. Should Hitler and his entourage ever decide to use the ship, there were rooms set aside. Hitler never used the facilities. To the left of Hitler's potential accommodation, there was a smaller suite with a bathroom reserved for NSDAP, Nazi Party, Reichsleiter Robert Ley, who was in charge of the KDF. This meant that there were beds for a maximum of 1,471 passengers, including the floating youth hostel and what was dubbed the leaders' rooms, as well as 426 crew members. The 22 lifeboats had enough space for these 1,897 people. Davits, that is a small crane on board a ship, especially one of a pair for suspending or lowering a lifeboat, were allocated for 10 motor lifeboats and 1 rowing boat, and were installed on each side. The motor-powered lifeboats were designed for 95 people each, 2 of which were smaller and held only 39 people. The 2 rowing boats suspended at the very front could each hold 65 people. On the last voyage of the Gustloff, however, not all davits were occupied by boats, and some appear to have been affected by the freezing weather and were frozen. Although the Wilhelm Gustloff was designed as a passenger ship, use as a hospital ship was also taken into account from the outset. This is a clear demonstration that, although the theoretical use was for providing holidays for the masses, the Nazis had considered the military use right from the start. The elevators were designed to transport hospital beds, and the cabins had piping for oxygen supply. In this photograph from the autumn of 1939, we can see the Wilhelm Gustloff in Stettin as a hospital ship, recognizable by the white paint and the 180 centimeter wide green band that runs around the hull below the railing. Additionally, the chimney bears the symbol of the Red Cross. In this photograph, we can see German wounded from the Battle of Narvik on the Wilhelm Gustloff in July 1940. Although the ship was large, the diesel engines were not designed for speed. The reason was that as the ship was needed for cruises or as a hospital ship, then high speed was not required. In the event of a power failure, a power generator located in the emergency dynamo room on the sun deck provided the emergency lighting. When constructed, the Wilhelm Gustloff was the largest cruise ship in the world. It measured over 208 meters long and was almost 24 meters wide. When the war started, all the cruises were stopped. Although used initially as a hospital ship, the ship was eventually painted grey and spent most of the war in Gdynia harbour as a floating barracks for the cadets of the 2nd U-Boat Training Division. On the 20th of January 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz persuaded Hitler to give all fuel priority to military transports, and on the following day orders for Operation Hannibal were issued. All available German ships were to save whatever was of military use. Operation Hannibal was to be the largest sea evacuation of all time, aiming to bring military equipment and wounded troops who might recover back west, and if any could be fitted on board, then some civilian refugees could come too. As far as the Wilhelm Gustloff was concerned, priority had to go to bringing the U-boat cadets back to the west alongside any military equipment they had. It needs to be highlighted that the whole point of Operation Hannibal was to pull out military personnel and their equipment, and that the only provision for civilians was to be after these priorities had been met. Indeed, it was only due to some of the armed forces and local Nazi party officials who disregarded the instructions to allocate priority to, in some cases, useless military equipment that so many civilians were evacuated. In the case of the Wilhelm Gustloff, there was room to stuff refugees into every free corner of the ship. The captain of the Gustloff was Friedrich Petersen. In January 1945 he was 63, and he had not captained a ship in many years, and of course he had never captained a ship as big as this one. As far as he was concerned, he was going to have to learn on the job. Petersen had 2 young assistants assigned to manoeuvre the ship. In addition, Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, commander of the submarine officer cadets, took over military command. Therefore, the Wilhelm Gustloff would have 4 captains on a repainted cruise ship that would have to navigate through the Baltic Sea full of mines and submarines in the dead of winter. On the 29th of January 1945, thousands of people were waiting in Gdynia for the ship to depart. Many of them would have felt safe for the first time in a long time. At the beginning, the refugees were counted. Purser aspirant Heinz Schön was one of those people who wrote down the names of those boarding the ship. Priority went to pregnant women. The Wilhelm Gustloff even had a maternity ward. However, there were more people than boarding cards, and once 7,956 boarding cards were issued, there were none left. The crew refused to turn people away, and Schön estimated that over 2,000 got onto the ship before it sailed. In some ways, it might have seemed like a pre-war cruise. Children running around, loudspeakers reporting lost and found children, and these people were no doubt relieved that their trek was now over and that they were safe, or so it seemed. Late on 29th of January 1945, the Gustloff was ready to sail. Good news arrived during the night. A telegram from the Eastern Submarine High Command noted 3 enemy submarines in C-square Victor Tony 4923 surfaced, running slowly on a course southwest. They have been recorded and are being monitored. Central and Western Baltic Sea, free of submarines. Whereas these 3 Soviet submarines were being monitored, there was a 4th submarine the Eastern U-Boat Command does not seem to have seen. This is odd, as it already come into contact with this submarine. It was the Soviet S-13 under Captain Alexander Marinesko. Marinesko had left Poltava Naval Base near Helsinki on the 11th of January 1945 and took position near Kolberg, today Kołobrzeg, on the 13th of January. It appears that the submarine's departure had been delayed owing to the alcohol problems of Captain Marinesko, which meant that the submarine was alone. At around 12:20 on the 30th of January 1945, the 12th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power, 4 tugboats pulled the Wilhelm Gustloff away from the pier. The ship was to travel in a convoy together with the passenger ship Hansa, protected by 3 smaller warships. The Hansa was still lying at anchor in the Bay of Gdańsk. The Hansa signalled, "Machine damage. Further running is delayed." Captain Peterson and the submarine instructor Zahn decided to sail anyway. Instead of the promised 3 warships, there were only 2, the torpedo boat Lure and an old minesweeper. The wind got rough, 5 to 6 Beaufort, and there were snow flurries. The Wilhelm Gustloff, although underpowered, was still able to ram into the short, hard waves of the Baltic Sea, but the minesweeper, unable to maintain the speed and course, turned back. Only the Lure remained as protection. Peterson and Zahn had 2 decisions to make, and they made 2 mistakes. Zahn, the experienced submarine man, knew that only speed could save them. Submarines were slower than ships. Zahn wanted Peterson to drive the Gustloff full steam ahead at 50 knots. "Impossible," countered Peterson. He feared that the long-neglected engine wouldn't hold out. In addition, the Wilhelm Gustloff had been slightly damaged in an air raid. Whereas the damage had been repaired, Peterson was fearful that the welding work was not up to scratch. Therefore, he permitted no more than 12 knots, or 22.2 kilometers per hour, a speed at which the Soviet submarines could match. The 2 agreed on the course. Far out at sea, a cleared route led through the minefields, called the Forced Route 58. And then there was a very narrow alley in the shallow water next to the coast. With a draft of only 7 meters, the Wilhelm Gustloff could still sail there. Submarines would not dare go in such shallow water. They could not submerge and would be at the mercy of shelling. But the 2 captains were afraid of air raids and mines in the narrow corridor, and against the advice of an experienced officer, chose the course across the high seas. With no lights, the Wilhelm Gustloff and the Lure sailed their way through the dark night. Only rarely did breaks in the cloud allow the moon to be seen. At around 1800, a mate stormed onto the bridge. He brought a radio message. A minesweeper was coming towards the Gustloff, exactly on collision course. This radio message is still a mystery. Why? Because there was no minesweeping unit. The captains ordered the navigation lights to be turned on as though in peacetime. This will be the final mistake. If a ship comes to, we will take it by the horns, Peterson rebuffed an officer who protested. When the Gustloff's lights came on, Marinesko's submarine had just surfaced. The officer on duty in the conning tower saw the large ship immediately, and then the Lure. Marinesko pushed the submarine into full throttle. His plan was to catch up with the other 2 ships on a parallel course, that is between them and the coast. There, the Lure was less of a threat as it was covering the starboard side of the cruiser. The hunt was on. At 19:30 hours, the lights of the Wilhelm Gustloff were switched off. Nonetheless, the S-13 was getting closer, but it still needed another 2 hours to catch up. The target seemed huge to Marinesko, perhaps a troop transport, he surmised, packed with men who had trampled the earth of Mother Russia and were now on the run. When the S-13 finally caught up with the Wilhelm Gustloff, Marinesko had the 4 bow tubes armed. According to the later legend, the torpedo in one tube read for the motherland, torpedo 2 read for Stalin, the 3rd read for the Soviet people, and the 4th read for Leningrad. They were set to a depth of 3 meters. When the commander gave the order to fire, 3 torpedoes were sent through the water. For Stalin got stuck in the tube too, but the other torpedoes hit. When they exploded, the end of the national anthem was playing on German radio. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, had just finished his speech on the 12th anniversary of his seizure of power in 1933. It was 21:16 hours. The projectiles shred the outer skin of the gigantic ship. There was a mass panic in the corridors as people sought to escape. Some were trampled to death, others crushed by steel walls. Those that ended up in the icy water didn't live very long and died of hypothermia. Witnesses reported hundreds of children floating upside down in the water. All had life jackets on, but their little heads were heavier than their legs, and their legs stuck up out of the water. The young girls to whom the officers had assigned the swimming pool of the former cruise ship as their quarters were the first to die. They were naval assistants, several dozen, mostly only 17 or 18 years old. The pool was located near the bow of the Gustloff on the deepest deck, a few meters below the waterline. That is where the second of the 3 torpedoes hit. Ursula Pouts, one of the few young women who escaped, later recounted. It was as if iron plates were being banged together with insane force. Screams of terror rang through the air. I saw devastation, overturned lockers, trapped, screaming girls. Through the door that led to the swimming pool, water was pouring in. I tore it open and saw a horrible picture. My comrades were lying everywhere, some of them already flooded with water, a screaming, praying bunch. The girls who weren't dead or drowned tried to reach the top of the stairs, but the bulkheads were tight. There was no escape. We were locked in. One of the girls yelled. They locked us in. The wide lower promenade deck with its armoured glass fronts also became a glass coffin for hundreds of people. At that moment, the senior machinist, Johann Smruchek, had already saved himself on the sun deck further up. And then I saw the drama below. Through the armoured glass, I couldn't hear any screams, nothing at all, but the people were crowded in there like sardines. And the deck was already halfway in the water, and I saw flashes, the muzzle flashes of pistols. Officers shot their families with them. Years after the war, a diver saw many strange balls floating behind the panes, big and small. They were the skulls of the drowned passengers. Purser aspirant Heinz Schön climbed onto one of the few lifeboats on the starboard side. It was totally overcrowded with women and children. Some men were clinging to the edge of the boat and were hanging in the air. Those in the boats hit their hands so their weight would not bring them all down. One after the other they fell, plunging into the sea. Finally, some people launched the boat, but just then the ship suddenly tilted even further. An anti-aircraft gun broke loose. It slid across the sloping deck, shot overboard and crushed the boat that had just been launched. Here the Baltic Sea is 60 meters deep. The highest point on the Wilhelm Gustloff was 58 meters from the keel to the top of the chimney. Therefore, there was not the murderous downwards pull that happened, for example, with the sinking of the Titanic. Peterson had enough time to make his way to one of the boats that were heaved up onto the sun deck before departure. Marine painter Bock made it to the same boat. He later described the catastrophe in a report. In the dim moonlight, I saw a high wave rolling over the sinking command bridge and washing away everything that was hanging on the railing. I heard the penetrating screams of death. Then our cutter was swept up by the tide, and we were thrown against the chimney structures with full force. Then everything sank. Only an endless tangle of screaming people, wreckage, rafts, and boys remained. For some unknown reason, just before the ship went under, all the lights on the cruiser came on, and the sirens wailed for the last time as if in death agony. The lower was far too small to assist all the drowning people around it. However, it did manage to rescue 472 people. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper left Gdynia together with the torpedo boat T-36 shortly after Wilhelm Gustloff. The officers on board saw the lure's distress signals, the red flares, Commander Herring of the T-36 stopped his engines, as did the captain of the Hipper. Together they managed to rescue 564 people. Captains Peterson and Zahn got out of their lifeboat and onto the rescue ship. Herring did not judge them, because there was no time for that. The submarine was still there. On the bridge, Herring suddenly saw the bubble marks of 2 torpedoes. They were heading straight for the T-36. He gave the command, full speed ahead, with a hard rudder. The T-36 managed to dodge the torpedoes over dozens of heads in the water. 2 of the crew were recovering shipwrecked people at the stern. They went overboard and stayed behind forever. That was the worst moment of my life, said Herring later. Once again, Herring turned to and pulled shipwrecked people out of the water. Then the T-36, unrestrainedly overloaded, had to go. 1,239 people were saved by a number of German ships in the area. Torpedo boat T-36 rescued 564 people. Torpedo boat Lohr, 472 people. Minesweeper M387, 98 people. Minesweeper M375, 43 people. Minesweeper M341, 37 people. The steamer Göttingen saved 28 people. The torpedo boat TF-19 saved 7. The freighter Gotland 2 people. And the picket boat 1703 saved 1 person, a 1-year-old child. As we do not know how many people on board ship, we don't know how many victims there were, but it was probably in the order of 9,000 people. That is to say, around 6 times as many as the losses on the Titanic. The purser Heinz Schön spent years studying the disaster he survived. He suggested that 9,343 people died. In March 2003, the Discovery Channel's Unsolved History series undertook a computer analysis of the sinking. Using maritime exodus software, it estimated that 9,600 people died by taking into account passenger densities based on witness reports and a simulation of escape routes and survivability with the timeline of the sinking. In all probability, this was the greatest maritime disaster of all time. However, there was another ship that went down very close to where the Wilhelm Gustloff was sunk. And the story of that ship, the Goya, you can hear in another video I prepared. So thanks very much for listening. I have a number of videos on the fate of the German refugees from East Prussia, as well as other videos relating to the history of what is today northern Poland, and of course the Second World War in general. I upload every Friday at 2000 hours Central European time, and sometimes at other times as well. So I'd encourage you to subscribe to know when I am uploading. But for the moment, thank you very much for listening, and all the best from me in Poland.